This is a true story of how a war at sea was won not by bigger guns or faster ships, but by mathematicians solving puzzles in a country mansion hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. In the early years of World War II, German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be built. Over 500 ships destroyed in 1942 alone, carrying food, fuel, and weapons Britain desperately needed to survive. Convoys sailed into the Atlantic knowing they were being hunted by wolfpacks. Coordinated groups of submarines that struck at night, turned the ocean into a graveyard, and vanished before dawn. But then something changed. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park cracked the German naval Enigma, one of the most complex encryption systems ever created. Radio operators using high-frequency direction finding, HFDF or Huff Duff, began pinpointing U-boat locations from their own transmissions, and suddenly the hunters became the hunted. By May 1943, U-boat losses were so catastrophic that Admiral Dönitz ordered his submarines to withdraw from the North Atlantic, ending the greatest threat to Allied victory. What you're about to hear is the story of how invisible intelligence work, codes, radio signals, and silent calculations turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic and saved thousands of lives that would have been lost at sea. The early terror. When U-boats ruled the Atlantic in 1940 and 1941, the Atlantic Ocean was a killing field. German U-boats operating in coordinated groups called wolfpacks stalked Allied convoys with terrifying efficiency. A typical attack began at night. U-boats would surface, spot a convoy silhouetted against the moonlight, and fire torpedoes at close range. Ships would explode, burn, and sink within minutes. Survivors, if there were any, were left floating in freezing water, clinging to debris, hoping a rescue ship might find them before hypothermia or drowning claimed them. The numbers were staggering. In 1940, U-boats sank over 2 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1941, the figure rose to 3 million tons. By 1942, the toll had climbed to nearly 6 million tons, equivalent to over 1,000 merchant ships sent to the bottom. For every ship sunk, dozens of sailors died. Food shipments meant for British civilians never arrived. Fuel tankers carrying oil for factories and airfields burned at sea. Weapons and ammunition destined for the front lines were lost forever. Britain was an island nation that imported most of its food and raw materials. If the U-boats could cut those supply lines, Britain would starve. Its factories would shut down, and the war would be lost, without a single German soldier setting foot on British soil. Winston Churchill later wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain." Imagine you're a merchant sailor in 1941, standing on the deck of a cargo ship in the middle of the Atlantic. It's night. The convoy is moving slowly, maybe 8 knots, zigzagging to make it harder for submarines to line up a shot. You're not allowed to show lights. The ocean is black, the wind is cold, and you know, from the reports you've heard, that U-boats are out there, watching, waiting. You hear it before you see it, a dull thud, like distant thunder, then a flash of light on the horizon. One of the ships in your convoy has been hit. Within seconds, flames are shooting into the sky. The ship is listing, sinking. You hear screams over the radio, sailors abandoning ship, calling for help. But your ship can't stop. If you stop, you become a sitting target. The convoy keeps moving, leaving the survivors behind. That was the reality for Allied sailors in the early years of the war. And the worst part? The U-boats seemed to know exactly where the convoys were going. They were waiting at the right place, at the right time, as if they could read the Allies' minds. And in a way they could, because the Allies couldn't read theirs. The challenge, naval Enigma, was almost unbreakable. The German Navy used a version of the Enigma machine to encrypt all its communications. Orders to U-boat captains, position reports, convoy sighting reports, weather data, everything. Enigma was a cipher machine that scrambled messages using a series of rotating wheels, each with 26 positions, creating billions of possible settings. To decrypt a message, you needed to know the exact wheel positions, ring settings, and plugboard connections used when the message was encrypted. The German army and Air Force Enigma machines had been partially broken by Polish mathematicians before the war, and by 1940, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading many Army and Luftwaffe messages. But the naval version, used by the Kriegsmarine and U-boats, was far more complex. It had an extra rotor, different key procedures, and stricter security protocols. And critically, the Allies didn't have the codebooks that listed the daily settings. Without those settings, breaking naval Enigma was nearly impossible. The mathematicians at Bletchley Park could work for weeks on a single day's messages and still come up empty. And by the time they cracked a message, the information was often days old, useless for stopping an attack that had already happened. Alan Turing, the brilliant mathematician leading the code-breaking effort, later described the naval Enigma problem as the hardest nut we ever had to crack. Meanwhile, at sea, Allied sailors were dying, convoys were being slaughtered, and the code breakers were stuck, racing against time, knowing that every day they failed to break the code, more ships went down. But then, in May 1941, something extraordinary happened. The capture, U-1110 and the codebooks that changed everything. On May 9, 1941, the British destroyer HMS Bulldog was escorting a convoy in the North Atlantic when it detected a submerged U-boat U-1110, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp. The Bulldog dropped depth charges, forcing U-110 to surface. The German crew, believing their submarine was sinking, abandoned ship and were taken prisoner. But U-110 didn't sink. It was still afloat, damaged but intact. And in a moment of extraordinary bravery and quick thinking, a Royal Navy boarding party, led by Sub-Lieutenant David Bombe, climbed aboard the abandoned submarine while it was still wallowing in the water, at risk of sinking or exploding at any moment. Inside, they found a treasure, an Enigma machine, intact and operational. And even more valuable, codebooks, tables, and documents that listed the daily settings used by the German Navy. These materials were quickly transferred to HMS Bulldog, and the submarine was left to sink, taking its secrets and the fact that the British had captured them to the bottom. The captured materials were rushed to Bletchley Park. Within weeks, the code breakers were reading German naval messages. Not all of them, but enough to make a difference. For the first time, Allied commanders could see what the U-boats were doing, where they were positioned, and what their orders were. But this advantage was fragile. The Germans didn't know the British had captured the materials, so they didn't change their procedures yet. And the British had to be extraordinarily careful not to reveal that they were reading German messages, or the Germans would change their codes immediately and the window would close. One intelligence officer later said, "We had the key to the door, but we could only use it if the Germans didn't realize we were in the room." Bletchley Park, Hut 8, and the Silent War. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the English countryside, a team of mathematicians, linguists, and analysts worked around the clock in Hut 8, the section dedicated to breaking German naval codes. The team was led by Alan Turing, whose theoretical work on computation and code breaking laid the foundation for modern computer science. Turing and his colleagues designed a machine called the Bombe, an electromechanical device that could test thousands of possible Enigma settings per minute, searching for the correct configuration that would decrypt a message. The bombs were massive, noisy machines, filling entire rooms with clicking relays and spinning drums. Operators, mostly young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRNS, known as WRENs, fed encrypted messages into the machines and monitored the results. When a bomber found a possible solution, cryptanalysts would test it manually, decrypting the message and checking whether the German text made sense. If it did, they had the day's settings, and every message encrypted with those settings could be read. But even with the bombs, the work was slow, difficult, and never certain. The Germans changed their Enigma settings every day at midnight. That meant the code breakers had to crack the new settings every single day, starting from scratch, racing against the clock. Some days they succeeded within hours. Other days it took most of the day or longer. And some days they failed entirely. Inside Hut 8, the atmosphere was intense. The walls were covered with charts, tables, and scribbled calculations. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and tea. People worked in shifts, sleeping on cots when they were too exhausted to continue. They knew that every message they decrypted, every hour they saved, could mean the difference between a convoy reaching port safely or being torn apart by torpedoes. One Wren operator, Joan Clark, one of the few women allowed to work as a full crypt analyst, later recalled, "We didn't see the ships, we didn't see the sailors, but we knew they were out there depending on us. If we failed, people died. That's what kept us going, even when we were exhausted and the work seemed impossible." The intelligence produced at Bletchley Park was given the codename Ultra. It was the most closely guarded secret of the war. Only a handful of senior commanders were allowed to know that the British were reading German messages, and they were under strict orders never to act on ultra intelligence in a way that might reveal its source. If a convoy was warned to change course because Ultra had revealed a U-boat wolfpack waiting ahead, the British would sometimes stage a fake reconnaissance flight over the area first, so the Germans would think they'd been spotted by a plane, not betrayed by their own codes. It was a chess game played in shadows, where every move had to be calculated to preserve the secret that might win the war. Huff Duff, hunting U-boats by their own voices. Codebreaking wasn't the only weapon the Allies developed against U-boats. Another critical innovation was high-frequency direction finding, known as HFDF or Huff Duff. U-boats had to communicate with their command headquarters regularly, reporting positions, sighting convoys, requesting orders, sending weather data. These radio transmissions were encrypted with Enigma, but even an encrypted message had to be broadcast over radio waves, and radio waves could be detected. The Allies built a network of HFDF stations along the coasts of Britain, Iceland, Newfoundland, and aboard escort ships. These stations could detect the brief radio bursts transmitted by U-boats and measure the direction the signal came from. If two or more stations detected the same transmission, they could triangulate the U-boat's position with surprising accuracy, often within a few dozen miles. The beauty of Huff Duff was that it was passive. The Germans didn't know they were being tracked. Every time a U-boat captain sent a message to headquarters, thinking he was safely hidden beneath the waves or surfaced at night in empty ocean, he was giving away his location. Combined with ultra-intelligence, which told the Allies what the U-boats were saying, Huff Duff told them where the U-boats were when they said it. Together, these tools transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a desperate defensive struggle into an offensive hunt. Convoy commanders could now reroute ships around known U-boat positions. Escort ships and aircraft could be directed to areas where U-boats were operating. And instead of waiting to be attacked, Allied forces could strike first, dropping depth charges, forcing U-boats to dive, disrupting their attacks, and sinking them before they could fire a single torpedo. One Royal Navy officer described the shift. "Before Ultra and Huff Duff, we were blind men stumbling in the dark, hoping we'd survive. After, we could see. Not perfectly, but enough. And that made all the difference." A convoy battle, two sides of the hunt. Let me take you inside a convoy battle in early 1943, seen from both sides, the U-boat captain hunting and the Allied escort commander defending, with invisible codebreakers and radio operators shaping the outcome. The U-boat perspective. It's February 1943. You're the commander of U-456, a Type VIC submarine operating in the North Atlantic. Your orders: find and attack convoy HX-229, reported to be carrying war supplies from New York to Britain. You've been at sea for 3 weeks. Your crew is exhausted. The air inside the submarine is thick with diesel fumes and body odor, and food supplies are running low. But you've just received a coded message from BDU, the U-boat command, giving you the convoy's estimated position and speed. You surface at night to recharge batteries and send a position report. I'm proceeding to intercept. Will attack at dawn. You transmit the message in Enigma encrypted code and submerge again. What you don't know, your radio transmission was detected by 3 Huff Duff stations. Your position has been triangulated. And at Bletchley Park, your message was decrypted within hours. Allied commanders now know you're hunting HX-229, and they know roughly where you are. The Allied escort perspective. You're the captain of HMS Harvester, a destroyer escorting convoy HX-229. Your job is to protect 40 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and ammunition across 3,000 miles of open ocean. At midnight, you receive an urgent coded message from the Admiralty in London. Ultra intelligence indicates U-boat wolfpack forming grid square BE-14. Recommend immediate course change 20 degrees south. You don't know how they know. You're not told about Ultra. You're just told to trust the intelligence. You order the convoy to change course. By dawn, HX-229 is 50 miles south of where the U-boats expected it to be. U-456 searches for hours, but finds nothing. Frustrated and low on fuel, the U-boat captain gives up and moves to another area. The convoy reaches Britain safely. None of the merchant sailors ever know how close they came to disaster, or that their lives were saved by people they'll never meet, working in a country mansion with pencils, paper, and electromechanical machines. Black May 1943, the tide turns. By May 1943, the combination of ultra-intelligence, Huff Duff, improved radar, long-range aircraft, and better tactics had transformed the Battle of the Atlantic. The month became known as Black May among German submariners because it was a slaughter. In May 1943 alone, 43 U-boats were sunk, more than in any previous month of the war. U-boat crews, which had once felt invincible, were now terrified. The life expectancy of a U-boat on patrol dropped to weeks. Crews began calling U-boats iron coffins. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, was forced to make a devastating decision. On May 24, 1943, he ordered most U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. The wolfpack strategy had failed. The Allies had won the Battle of the Atlantic, not through brute force, but through intelligence, technology, and the silent work of people the enemy never saw. The statistics tell the story. In 1942, U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships. In 1943, the number dropped to under 500. By 1944, U-boats were a nuisance, not a strategic threat. Thousands of merchant sailors, naval personnel, and civilians whose food shipments now arrived safely owed their lives to the codebreakers, radio operators, and intelligence analysts who had turned the tide. One survivor of a 1943 convoy later said, "We heard rumors after the war that the British had been reading German codes. I didn't believe it at first. But when I learned it was true, I realized that's why we made it. That's why my ship didn't burn. Someone, somewhere knew where the U-boats were and steered us away. I never met them, but I owe them my life." The human cost of intelligence work. It's easy to think of code breaking as abstract, mathematics, machines, puzzles. But behind every broken code was a human being, working under immense pressure, knowing that failure meant death for people they would never meet. Some of the Bletchley Park staff suffered breakdowns from the stress. Others worked themselves to exhaustion. And they couldn't talk about it. Not to their families, not to their friends, not even to each other outside of work. The Official Secrets Act bound them to silence, and many kept that silence for decades after the war ended. Joan Clark, Alan Turing's colleague and close friend, later said, "People ask me what it was like. I tell them, imagine being handed a puzzle every morning and told, if you solve this by tonight, a ship full of men might survive. If you don't, they'll die. That's what it felt like, every single day." And there was another darker side. The secrecy surrounding Ultra meant that sometimes the intelligence couldn't be acted on, because doing so would have revealed the source. Convoys were sometimes allowed to sail into danger if diverting them would have made the Germans suspicious. Lives were sacrificed to protect the secret that might save more lives later. It was a brutal calculus, and the people who made those decisions carried the weight for the rest of their lives. The legacy, how intelligence shaped modern warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic was the first major conflict where intelligence, code breaking, signals intelligence, electronic warfare played a decisive strategic role. It proved that wars could be won not just by soldiers, sailors, and pilots, but by mathematicians, linguists, and engineers working far from the front lines. The lessons learned at Bletchley Park and in the Atlantic laid the foundation for modern intelligence agencies, electronic surveillance, and cybersecurity. The Bombe machines were precursors to digital computers. The organizational structures developed to handle ultra-intelligence became models for Cold War intelligence operations. And the ethical questions remain. When is it acceptable to sacrifice some lives to save others? How much secrecy is justified in the name of security? And what do we owe to the invisible people who do the hardest, most essential work and are never allowed to take credit for it? Closing questions and call to action. Many of you have told me that the stories of code breakers and hidden intelligence work fascinate you most, because they show that wars are won not just by the loud, visible heroes, but by the quiet, invisible ones working in basements and back rooms, solving problems no one else can see. The Battle of the Atlantic is one of those stories. It's a reminder that the greatest victories often come from the people whose names we'll never know, whose work we'll never see, but whose courage and brilliance changed the course of history. But I want to ask you, first, if you'd been a merchant sailor in 1943 and you later learned that code breakers had saved your convoy, how would you feel knowing that other convoys were deliberately left unprotected to preserve the secret? Second, do you think Alan Turing and the Bletchley Park team deserve more recognition than they've received, or is there something fitting about their work remaining largely hidden even after the war? And third, how much of World War II's outcome do you think depended on intelligence and technology versus traditional military strength? Could the Allies have won without breaking Enigma? Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And if this story gave you a new perspective on how wars are really won, share this video, subscribe. Because the people who fight wars in silence, with math and radios instead of guns, deserve to be remembered just as much as the ones on the front lines. The code breakers hunted U-boats with numbers and patience, and they saved thousands of lives without ever setting foot on a ship.